On a brutal winter night, as darkness swallowed the forest and temperatures plummeted to merciless depths, Elliot sat alone in his remote cabin, the crackling fire his only companion. The howling wind carried something unusual, a sound so faint, yet so desperate that it pierced through the storm's fury and reached his ears. What began as merely a whisper soon transformed into unmistakable cries, fragile yet persistent against the unforgiving elements. Something was calling for help just beyond his wooden door, something fighting against the overwhelming force of nature itself. With hesitation in his steps, but compassion in his heart, Elliot wrapped himself in his thickest coat and ventured into the blinding snowstorm. The beam of his flashlight cut through the swirling white abyss, finally revealing a sight that stopped his breath, a tiny bundle of orange fur, nearly buried beneath the freshly fallen snow. There, trembling between life and death, lay a kitten no larger than his palm. Its delicate body was encased in a thin layer of ice, its once vibrant fur now crystallized by frost. Those piercing blue eyes, barely open, held a plea more powerful than words could ever express. Time seemed to freeze as Elliot faced this unexpected moment of truth. This wasn't just a stray animal. This was a miracle clinging to the edge of existence, a flicker of life refusing to be extinguished by winter's cruel grip. With gentle hands that belied his rugged appearance, Elliot cradled the frozen creature against his chest. The kitten's heartbeat, though faint, pulsed with an extraordinary will to survive that defied all odds. What had brought this tiny soul to his doorstep on such a treacherous night? And what extraordinary twist of fate had allowed its cries to reach him through the raging storm? As he carried the fragile passenger back toward the golden warmth of his cabin, Elliot couldn't possibly foresee how this moment would transform not just one life, but two. In the heart of winter's darkest hour, an unlikely bond was forming, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about connection, healing, and the mysterious ways that souls find each other when they need it most. The kitten lay motionless on Elliot's weathered table, its once vibrant spirit now reduced to shallow, irregular breaths that barely disturbed the silence of the cabin. Ice still clung to its matted fur, and its eyes, once bright with desperate plea, remained closed, as if surrendering to the inevitable embrace of winter's cruel verdict. Elliot stood frozen in uncertainty, his calloused hands hovering helplessly above the diminutive creature. What did he know about saving lives? He was a man of solitude, more acquainted with wilderness survival than nursing fragile beings back from death's doorstep. The nearest veterinarian was miles away across impassable roads now buried beneath feet of unforgiving snow. "I'm no miracle worker," he whispered to the empty room, his voice betraying the weight of responsibility that had unexpectedly fallen upon his shoulders. Yet something about this tiny fighter, who had somehow found him amid the vast, uncaring wilderness, stirred something long dormant within his heart. With trembling fingers, Elliot reached for a soft towel, gently beginning to dry the kitten's frozen coat. Each careful stroke revealed more of the creature's true color, a rich tapestry of orange and cream, a flame that refused to be extinguished by the cold. The kitten's heartbeat fluttered beneath his touch like a trapped butterfly, erratic yet persistent in its will to survive. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as Elliot worked. He fashioned a makeshift nest beside the fire, its golden warmth casting dramatic shadows across the cabin walls. Every few minutes, he checked for signs of improvement, his own breath catching whenever the kitten's breathing faltered. "Come on, little fighter," he murmured. "You didn't come all this way just to give up now." As the storm raged outside, transforming the world into an impenetrable fortress of white, man and kitten found themselves locked in an intimate battle against fate itself. What strange twist of destiny had brought them together on this night of all nights? And what extraordinary power had guided this tiny soul through the blizzard to the one cabin where it might find salvation? In the flickering firelight, Elliot watched and waited, his heart suspended between hope and fear. As the relentless blizzard raged against the cabin walls like a hungry beast seeking entry, Elliot knelt before the dancing flames of his hearth, a sacred ritual of revival unfolding before him. The kitten, this fragile spark of life, lay cradled in his weathered hands, its tiny body still disturbingly motionless against the backdrop of crackling embers that painted the room in amber hues. With reverence befitting a priceless treasure, Elliot wrapped the diminutive creature in his softest flannel blanket, creating a cocoon of gentle warmth. The contrast was striking. his large, calloused fingers moving with unexpected tenderness around a being so desperately small, so perilously close to slipping away. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the symphony of winter's fury outside. The words hung in the air like a prayer, a desperate plea to whatever forces might be listening. Elliot reached for the small pot of milk he'd warmed by the fire, his movements deliberate and careful. Using an eyedropper salvaged from a forgotten first aid kit, he administered tiny droplets of warmth to the kitten's mouth. Most dribbled down its chin, but occasionally, miraculously, a reflexive swallow would follow, the faintest evidence that death had not yet claimed its prize. Hour after endless hour, Elliot maintained his vigil. His rough hands gently massaged the kitten's delicate paws, coaxing life back into frozen extremities. He stroked its chest, encouraging each breath, celebrating every faint heartbeat as a victory against the inevitable. The night deepened around them, the storm's howl transforming into a mournful lullaby. And then, a moment so subtle yet profound it nearly stopped Elliot's heart, the kitten's paw twitched. Its tiny pink tongue emerged, just barely, seeking another drop of milk. Tears welled in Elliot's eyes, glistening in the firelight. This wasn't just a stray animal warming by his fire. This was life itself fighting back against impossible odds, a miracle unfolding in his trembling hands. As dawn's first tentative light crept through frost-covered windows, the kitten's eyes fluttered open, brilliant blue orbs meeting Elliot's gaze with unexpected clarity. A soft, barely audible purr vibrated against his fingers, a sound so small yet so powerful it seemed to fill the entire cabin with its triumphant melody. In that breathtaking moment of connection, something profound shifted within Elliot's soul, a thawing more significant than the one happening to the tiny creature in his hands. As midnight descended upon the forest cabin, wrapping it in a cloak of profound darkness, Elliot sat motionless in his weathered armchair, his gaze never leaving the fragile bundle nestled in the makeshift bed he'd created. The fierce storm outside had transformed into something more haunting, a distant, mournful howl that seemed to echo the precarious nature of the tiny life before him. The kitten's chest rose and fell in shallow, uncertain rhythms, each breath a delicate negotiation with fate itself. Occasionally, its paws would twitch, fleeting moments of movement that sent waves of hope through Elliot's weary heart, only to be followed by extended stillness that rekindled his deepest fears. "Why you?" he whispered into the firelit darkness, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Why did you find me of all people?" The question hung suspended in the warm air, unanswered except for the soft crackle of burning logs. Elliot's calloused fingers gently stroked the kitten's head, marveling at how something so small could command such immense concern from a man who had long ago chosen solitude over connection. There was something about those eyes, those fleeting moments when they had opened, revealing depths of blue that seemed impossible for such a tiny creature, that had reached into the most guarded chambers of his heart. What mysterious force had guided this soul through the merciless blizzard to his doorstep? What cosmic design had determined that these two lost beings should find each other on this night of all nights? Hours stretched into an eternity as Elliot maintained his vigilant watch. Every sound from the kitten, every subtle shift or sigh, sent him leaning forward, his breath caught in his throat. When the creature attempted to lift its head, only to collapse back in exhaustion, Elliot felt the weight of that failure as though it were his own. "You're fighting so hard," he murmured, carefully administering another droplet of warm milk. "I don't even know if you can hear me, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." As dawn's first tentative light began to filter through frost-covered windows, painting the room in ethereal blues and purples, Elliot found himself transformed by this unexpected night of stewardship. Something profound had awakened within him, something he had believed long extinguished by years of isolation and self-imposed exile. In the silent communion between man and kitten, a truth was emerging that would forever alter the landscape of two souls, one large, one impossibly small, brought together by winter's most desperate hour. First light filtered through the frost-etched windows, transforming Elliot's cabin into a cathedral of amber and gold. The long night of uncertainty had finally surrendered to dawn, yet Elliot remained in his vigil-worn chair, eyes heavy but vigilant, refusing to abandon his post even as exhaustion claimed every fiber of his being. Then, a movement so subtle it might have been a trick of the morning light, the kitten's ears twitched, followed by the slow, deliberate opening of those impossible blue eyes. No longer glazed with the fog of imminent death, they now held something new, a spark, fragile but undeniable, like the first star emerging after the darkest storm. "You're still here," Elliot whispered, his voice cracking with emotion that surprised even himself. The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of a night spent bargaining with forces beyond understanding, a night where every breath had been a victory against overwhelming odds. The miracle continued to unfold before his disbelieving eyes. With trembling determination, the kitten placed one tiny paw forward, then another, each movement a defiance of the death sentence Winter had attempted to impose. Its legs wobbled precariously, like a newborn fawn taking its first steps into an uncertain world. Elliot held his breath, afraid to shatter the fragile magic of this moment with even the slightest sound. The kitten's journey across the blanket seemed monumental. Each inch conquered a testament to an extraordinary will to survive that defied all rational explanation. And then, in a moment that would forever be etched in Elliot's memory, the tiny creature looked up at him, not with the wild wariness of a forest animal, but with something that stirred forgotten chambers in his heart, complete and unwavering trust. As if this man, this stranger, was already recognized as sanctuary, as savior, as home. With one final valiant effort, the kitten reached Elliot's outstretched hand and collapsed against his palm, its tiny body vibrating with the faintest purr, a sound so delicate yet powerful enough to crack the walls Elliot had built around his heart through years of isolation. What mysterious bond had formed in the crucible of that desperate night? What ancient wisdom had guided this soul to seek him out among the endless expanse of wilderness? As morning light spilled across the cabin floor, illuminating man and kitten in its golden embrace, one truth became brilliantly clear. Sometimes the smallest creatures bring the most profound changes, and salvation often flows in both directions. In the silence of that sacred morning, something extraordinary was being born alongside the kitten's recovery, hope, returning to places long abandoned. As golden afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Elliot found himself smiling, a sensation so unfamiliar it almost felt foreign on his weathered face. Before him, the tiny miracle that had arrived on death's doorstep just hours earlier was now cautiously exploring its surroundings, each wobbly step growing more confident than the last. "Snowdrop," he whispered, the name emerging from somewhere deep within his soul. "That's who you are, a flower that pushes through impossible cold to bloom when all else remains dormant." The kitten's ears perked at the sound of its new name, those mesmerizing blue eyes finding Elliot's with an intelligence that seemed to transcend its diminutive size. In that gaze lay something profound. Recognition, connection, the invisible thread of destiny that had somehow guided this fragile being through a murderous blizzard to the exact place it needed to be. With surprising ingenuity, Elliot transformed an old wooden crate into a sanctuary worthy of his unexpected guest. He lined it with his softest flannel shirt, added a small pillow rescued from a forgotten closet, and placed it near the hearth where warming flames cast a protective glow. This wasn't just a bed, it was an offering, a physical manifestation of a promise being made between two souls. "This is your home now," he murmured, gently stroking Snowdrop's head with a single finger. "For as long as you want it to be." As evening approached, bringing with it the hushed reverence of a forest preparing for night, something extraordinary began to unfold. Snowdrop batted playfully at a string Elliot dangled, those same paws that had been frozen stiff, now animated with the irrepressible joy of youth. A tiny meow, the first vocalization since its rescue, echoed through rooms that had known only silence for far too long. Laughter escaped Elliot's lips, the sound startling him with its unfamiliarity. How long had it been since these walls had witnessed such a sound? How many solitary seasons had passed with only the wind as his conversation partner? As night settled once more upon the forest, man and kitten found themselves in a dance of mutual healing. The cabin, once a fortress of isolation, now pulsed with something long forgotten: life, connection, purpose. In Snowdrop's playful antics and trusting purrs, Elliot discovered something he hadn't realized he'd been missing: a reason to open his heart again. Some bonds, it seemed, were written in the stars long before they manifested in the physical world. With axe in hand and Snowdrop safely napping by the fire, Elliot ventured into the crystalline world beyond his cabin door. The storm had finally relented, leaving behind a pristine landscape transformed into a vast canvas of untouched white. Morning sunlight scattered across the snow in diamond-like fragments, nature's own display of defiant beauty after such devastating fury. As Elliot approached his woodpile, something unusual caught his trained eye, a subtle disruption in the perfect blanket of white. He knelt down, his breath forming delicate clouds in the frigid air, and found himself staring at what could only be described as impossible. A trail of tiny paw prints, barely visible beneath the fresh powder, leading away from the very spot where Snowdrop had been discovered. His heart quickened as he traced the diminutive tracks with weathered fingers. These weren't the markings of a forest predator or even a wild rabbit. These belonged to felines, unmistakably small and desperate in their uneven spacing. Snowdrop hadn't made this treacherous journey alone. "Where is your family?" he whispered, his words hanging suspended in the still winter air. Rising to his full height, Elliot's eyes followed the fragile trail as it disappeared into the dense line of pines that marked the boundary of his property. What tragedy had unfolded on that merciless night? What desperate circumstances had sent a family of cats into the teeth of a killing storm? The axe lay forgotten in the snow as Elliot found himself drawn forward, following these ghostly footprints like breadcrumbs leading to a truth he wasn't certain he wanted to discover. Each step carried the weight of growing dread, a premonition of heartbreak waiting beyond the tree line. Through the window, Snowdrop watched his movement with those impossibly blue eyes, as if aware that the mystery of her origins was slowly unraveling. Did she remember? Did she carry within her tiny heart the memory of others like her, of warmth shared and then lost in winter's cruel embrace? As Elliot stood at the forest's edge, poised between knowing and not knowing, a strange understanding washed over him. This wasn't just about a kitten found in a storm anymore. This was about uncovering a story that had chosen him as its witness, its keeper. Something profound awaited discovery among these trees, something that would test the newfound openness of his heart. The mystery of Snowdrop's past now beckoned with silent urgency, promising revelations that would forever alter two intertwined destinies, one human, one feline, both forever changed by an icy plea on a night when fate itself seemed to intervene. With each determined step into the dense forest, Elliot felt the weight of destiny pulling him forward along the ghostly path of tiny paw prints. The pristine snow crunched beneath his boots, the sound amplified in the profound silence that only winter's deepest embrace can create. Behind him, his cabin, warm, safe, known, grew smaller, while ahead lay only uncertainty and the haunting mystery of Snowdrop's origins. The trail wove through ancient pines standing like silent sentinels, their snow-laden branches forming cathedral-like arches overhead. Occasionally, the delicate tracks would disappear beneath fresh powder, only to emerge again a few feet ahead, as if the forest itself was guiding him toward a revelation he was meant to discover. Hours passed as Elliot pressed onward, his experienced eyes never losing sight of the fragile thread connecting him to an unknown past. The sun arced across the pale winter sky, casting ever-shifting shadows that danced across the snow-covered ground, marking the passage of precious daylight. Just as the growing cold began to seep through his layers, just as doubt whispered that he should turn back before darkness claimed the woods, something emerged on the horizon, the weathered silhouette of a structure nearly consumed by winter's fury. An old barn, its roof partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, stood in a small clearing like an ancient monument to forgotten times. Elliot approached with cautious reverence, noticing how the tiny tracks led directly toward the barn's tilted door, hanging precariously from a single rusted hinge. Something about the abandoned structure sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the biting cold, a sense that he stood on the threshold of a truth that would change everything. As he reached the entrance, the wind fell silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Elliot paused, his hand on the splintered wood, suddenly uncertain of what waited on the other side. Then he heard it, so faint he might have imagined it had he not been listening with every fiber of his being, a sound that stopped his heart and confirmed his deepest suspicions. A meow, weak but unmistakable, echoed from the shadowy depths within. Time seemed to freeze as Elliot stood transfixed between knowing and not knowing, between the safety of ignorance and the responsibility of truth. Whatever awaited him inside this forgotten place would forever alter the story that had begun with a tiny frozen kitten on his doorstep. A story that, he now realized, was far from reaching its conclusion. The barn door groaned in protest as Elliot pushed it open, releasing decades of dust into the frigid air. Weak winter light filtered through gaps in the dilapidated roof, casting ethereal beams across the forgotten interior, like spotlights searching for hidden treasures. The musty scent of aged hay and weathered wood filled his nostrils as he stepped across the threshold, following the pull of that haunting meow. His eyes, adjusting to the dimness, scanned the shadowy corners until they fell upon a sight that stole the breath from his lungs. There, nestled in a crude depression of old burlap and straw, lay two tiny forms huddled against each other in desperate pursuit of warmth that wasn't there. Kittens, unmistakably siblings to Snowdrop, their distinctive markings like echoes of the one who had somehow found her way to his door. "Dear God," Elliot whispered, his voice reverberating in the cavernous space. He knelt beside the makeshift nest, his heart constricting at the pitiful state of these abandoned souls. Their breathing came in shallow, sporadic bursts, their tiny bodies trembling with a cold so deep it seemed to radiate from their very cores. Unlike Snowdrop, who had summoned the strength to cry out in her final moments of hope, these two had retreated into the silent surrender that precedes death's final claim. Elliot's experienced eyes searched the barn with growing dread, seeking but not finding what should have been there: a mother, a protector, the architect of this humble shelter. Only emptiness answered his unspoken question, punctuated by the occasional groan of timber straining against winter's weight. "Where is she?" he murmured, gently touching one kitten's matted fur. "What happened to you?" A story began to form in his mind, each piece more heartbreaking than the last. Had she abandoned them, forced by primal instinct to save herself? Or had something more sinister befallen her, leaving these helpless creatures to a slow, cruel fate? The absence of larger tracks around the barn suggested she had never returned from whatever desperate mission had taken her from her baby's side. As Elliot carefully gathered the nearly lifeless kittens into his coat, cradling them against the warmth of his body, the magnitude of what he had discovered settled upon his shoulders like the weight of the very snow that blanketed the world outside. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a reckoning with nature's harshest truths, a glimpse into the silent tragedies that unfold daily in the wilderness, witnessed by none. The journey back would be a race against time itself, with two more precious lives hanging by the thinnest of threads. The forest, once a peaceful sanctuary, now seemed transformed into a hostile maze of obstacles as Elliot raced against the falling sun. Cradled against his chest, wrapped in the warmth of his coat, the two fragile kittens barely stirred, their stillness a terrifying reminder of how precariously they clung to life. Each labored breath they took sent clouds of desperation into the frigid air, visible markers of a battle they were losing with every passing moment. "Stay with me," Elliot pleaded, his voice raw with emotion as he forged through snowdrifts that reached his knees. "Just hold on a little longer." The journey that had taken hours on the way out now became a frantic dash, fueled by adrenaline and the burning certainty that seconds mattered. The temperature dropped mercilessly as afternoon surrendered to evening, painting the forest in deepening shadows that seemed to reach for him with icy fingers. Elliot's own breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles screaming in protest, yet he pushed forward with singular focus. These lives had been entrusted to him by forces he couldn't begin to understand. At last, the cabin emerged from the darkening woods like a beacon of impossible hope. Elliot crashed through the door, his frozen fingers fumbling with the latch, and rushed toward the hearth where flames still danced with life-giving warmth. As he gently placed the nearly frozen kittens on the blanket beside the fire, a blur of orange movement caught his eye. Snowdrop, her strength returning by the hour, approached the newcomers with curious intensity. Elliot watched, breath held, as she carefully sniffed the motionless bundles, and then, in a moment of recognition that transcended human understanding, she pressed her tiny body against her siblings and began to purr. The sound, though soft, filled the cabin with its vibration, a primal lullaby that spoke of shared blood and shared fate. Snowdrop nuzzled her littermates, licking their cold faces with determined affection, as if willing her own hard-won vitality to flow into their failing bodies. "You knew," Elliot whispered in awe. "Somehow, you knew they were still out there." Yet even as this miraculous reunion unfolded before his eyes, Elliot recognized the harsh truth reflected in the kitten's sunken sides and shallow breathing. Their journey back from death's threshold would be far more perilous than Snowdrop's had been. The night ahead would determine whether this family, already fractured by mysterious tragedy, would survive intact or suffer further devastating loss. As darkness claimed the world outside, Elliot prepared for another vigil, this one with 3 tiny lives hanging in the balance of winter's merciless equation. Days and nights blurred together as Elliot's cabin transformed into a sanctuary of relentless hope. The old wooden clock on the mantel marked not hours but miracles, each tiny improvement in the kitten's condition a victory against the overwhelming odds that had been stacked against them. Sleep became a luxury Elliot could rarely afford, his world narrowing to the rhythm of feeding schedules and the constant vigilance required to monitor 3 fragile lives. Every 2 hours, without fail, he prepared the special formula he'd concocted from supplies in his pantry. Warm milk enriched with the precious egg yolks he'd been saving, administered drop by painstaking drop from an eyedropper that had become his most treasured tool. His large hands, once more comfortable wielding axes and hunting rifles, now performed delicate work with surprising gentleness, massaging tiny bellies to stimulate digestion, cleaning miniature faces with a damp cloth warmed by the fire. "That's it," he would whisper as the weakest kitten, a little gray one he'd named Shadow, finally accepted nourishment. "Fight for it. I know you can." Snowdrop assumed the role of guardian with astonishing dedication, rarely leaving her sibling's side. Her own strength grew visibly with each passing day, as if her determination to see her family whole again had accelerated her recovery. She would purr constantly, the vibrations creating a healing energy that seemed to permeate the makeshift nest Elliot had crafted for them. The third kitten, a patchworked calico Elliot called Ember for the flickering spirit that refused to be extinguished, would often wake in the night, mewling with haunting urgency. During these moments, Elliot found himself sharing whispered stories of his own life, confessions he'd never spoken aloud to another soul, as if these tiny creatures had somehow been sent to hear the truth he'd been carrying alone for too long. Something profound was shifting within Elliot's heart, walls built over years of solitude crumbling like ancient ruins, unable to withstand the persistent warmth of new connection. The man who had once measured his days by the simplicity of survival now found meaning in the complex web of care he provided. His own needs became secondary to theirs, his own pain less significant when compared to their struggle. As the kitten's eyes grew brighter and their bodies stronger, Elliot caught glimpses of his own reflection in the cabin window, a face transformed not by the passage of time, but by the unexpected journey of becoming necessary to something beyond himself. The healing, it seemed, was flowing in both directions, mending wounds far deeper than those visible to the eye. Days and nights blurred together as Elliot's cabin transformed into a sanctuary of relentless hope. The old wooden clock on the mantel marked not hours, but miracles, each tiny improvement in the kitten's condition a victory against the overwhelming odds that had been stacked against them. Sleep became a luxury Elliot could rarely afford, his world narrowing to the rhythm of feeding schedules and the constant vigilance required to monitor 3 fragile lives. Every 2 hours, without fail, he prepared the special formula he'd concocted from supplies in his pantry, warm milk enriched with the precious egg yolks he'd been saving, administered drop by painstaking drop from an eyedropper that had become his most treasured tool. His large hands, once more comfortable wielding axes and hunting rifles, now performed delicate work with surprising gentleness, massaging tiny bellies to stimulate digestion, cleaning miniature faces with a damp cloth warmed by the fire. "That's it," he would whisper as the weakest kitten, a little gray one he'd named Shadow, finally accepted nourishment. "Fight for it. I know you can." Snowdrop assumed the role of guardian with astonishing dedication, rarely leaving her sibling's side. Her own strength grew visibly with each passing day, as if her determination to see her family whole again had accelerated her recovery. She would purr constantly, the vibrations creating a healing energy that seemed to permeate the makeshift nest Elliot had crafted for them. The third kitten, a patchworked calico Elliot called Ember for the flickering spirit that refused to be extinguished, would often wake in the night, mewling with haunting urgency. During these moments, Elliot found himself sharing whispered stories of his own life, confessions he'd never spoken aloud to another soul, as if these tiny creatures had somehow been sent to hear the truth he'd been carrying alone for too long. Something profound was shifting within Elliot's heart. Walls built over years of solitude, crumbling like ancient ruins, unable to withstand the persistent warmth of new connection. The man who had once measured his days by the simplicity of survival now found meaning in the complex web of care he provided. His own needs became secondary to theirs, his own pain less significant when compared to their struggle. As the kitten's eyes grew brighter and their bodies stronger, Elliot caught glimpses of his own reflection in the cabin window, a face transformed not by the passage of time, but by the unexpected journey of becoming necessary to something beyond himself. The healing, it seemed, was flowing in both directions, mending wounds far deeper than those visible to the eye. Golden light spilled from Elliot's cabin windows onto the pristine snow, creating a beacon of warmth against the encroaching twilight. On the porch, a small bowl of food waited, a humble offering placed with trembling hands and a heart full of impossible hope. Inside, 3 kittens slept peacefully by the fire, unaware that their world stood on the precipice of extraordinary change. Elliot watched from behind frosted glass, his breath creating fleeting clouds upon the window as he maintained his vigil. The forest had fallen silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what might unfold in this remote clearing where fate had orchestrated such an unlikely chain of events. Then, a shadow among shadows, moving with ghost-like caution from the protective embrace of the trees. The mother cat appeared like an apparition, her once sleek body now bearing the marks of her desperate journey. She paused at the edge of the cleared area, her amber eyes reflecting the cabin lights as she assessed potential danger with the wisdom of the wild. Minutes stretched into an eternity as Elliot remained perfectly still, afraid that even the slightest movement might shatter this fragile moment. The mother cat took one step forward, then another, her nose raised to capture scents carried on the evening breeze. Something in the air, something beyond the tempting aroma of food, seemed to quicken her movements, igniting a recognition that overrode her natural caution. With sudden purpose, she approached the cabin, bypassing the offered meal entirely. At the door, she paused, pressing her face against the weathered wood, inhaling deeply the mingled scents that seeped from within. A sound escaped her then, not quite a meow, something more primal and profound, a call that spoke of loss and desperate seeking. Inside, Snowdrop's head lifted suddenly, her tiny body becoming alert with electric awareness. Her siblings stirred beside her, responding to a voice they remembered from the very beginning of their existence. A chorus of answering cries rose from the makeshift nest, piercing Elliot's heart with their urgent recognition. With hands steady despite their trembling, Elliot opened the door just enough, an invitation, not a capture. The mother cat hesitated only a moment before slipping inside, her focus absolute as she followed the sounds of her children to the hearth. The reunion that unfolded transcended human understanding, a circle of tiny bodies pressing against their mother, a symphony of purrs vibrating through the cabin, a family fractured by circumstance now miraculously whole again. Tears streamed unashamedly down Elliot's weathered cheeks as he witnessed this moment of profound healing, this testament to a mother's love that had defied winter's cruelest sentence. In that sacred moment, the cabin seemed to pulse with a magic more powerful than any Elliot had ever known. The extraordinary magic of coming home. As spring's first tentative whispers began to soften winter's iron grip, Elliot found himself standing at the threshold of his cabin, watching the feline family that had transformed his solitary existence. The kittens, now vibrant bundles of energy, tumbled playfully across the wooden floor while their mother, strength restored to her once fragile frame, observed with vigilant amber eyes that held a new spark of life. The cabin, once an empty fortress against the world, now echoed with purrs and pattering paws, with unexpected joy and connection that had awakened long-dormant chambers in Elliot's heart. Each day brought new discoveries as the kittens explored their expanding world with boundless curiosity, claiming spaces that had known only silence for far too long. Yet beneath this domestic harmony, a truth waited to be acknowledged, one that Elliot had been pushing away with each sunrise. These were creatures of the wild, born to the freedom of forest paths and open skies. The mother cat, despite her growing trust, still carried the untamed spirit of her natural existence in every graceful movement. "What's the right thing to do?" Elliot whispered to the empty doorway, his question carried away by the spring breeze. To release them back into the wilderness seemed a betrayal of the bond that had formed through those desperate nights of shared survival. Yet to keep them confined within human walls might be a greater cruelty, denying them the very essence of their nature for his own comfort. A third path emerged in his mind, finding them a home where they could be safe yet free, loved yet respected for what they truly were. But this option carried its own pain, the inevitable separation, the end of this unexpected chapter that had rewritten so much of what Elliot believed about connection and purpose. As Snowdrop pressed against his ankle, purring with complete trust, Elliot felt the weight of this decision settle upon his shoulders. Some choices, it seemed, could only be made with the heart, even when every possible path led through the territory of loss. The rhythmic sound of hammer-striking nail echoed through the clearing as Elliot worked with focused determination, his weathered hands crafting something born of equal parts inspiration and love. Spring sunshine bathed his shoulders in golden warmth, a stark contrast to the merciless winter that had first brought this unlikely family together through ice and desperate circumstance. What emerged beneath his careful craftsmanship was neither cage nor simple shelter, but something that existed in the precious space between wild and tame. A small, perfectly proportioned structure nestled against a protective cluster of pines just 30 yards from his cabin door. Its walls, insulated with the same care he'd given his own home, promised warmth against future winters. Its multiple entrances honored the need for escape routes that all wild creatures understand in their bones. "Freedom with protection," Elliot murmured, as he installed a small flap door that would keep predators out while allowing his feline friends to come and go as their hearts desired. The best of both worlds. Inside, he created dedicated spaces, soft bedding in corners that caught the morning sun, elevated platforms that satisfied the cat's natural instinct to survey their domain from above. A covered feeding station would ensure that nourishment remained available regardless of weather's whims. Every detail spoke of deep understanding, of respect for the delicate balance between independence and connection. From the cabin window, the mother cat watched his progress with intelligent eyes that seemed to comprehend exactly what this structure represented. Not captivity, but choice. Her kittens, growing stronger with each passing day, tumbled in play nearby, already claiming the territory around both dwellings as their expanded kingdom. When the final nail was driven, Elliot stepped back, surveying his creation with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't goodbye. This was transformation, evolution, a new chapter written not in separation, but in mutual respect for needs both shared and different. That evening, as twilight painted the forest in lavender hues, Elliot watched from his porch as the mother cat led her curious brood to investigate their new domain. One by one, they explored the shelter's offerings, their movement between the structures creating an invisible bridge between his world and theirs. Snowdrop, forever the most trusting, returned to wind around his ankles before darting back to join her family, a perfect demonstration of the beautiful balance they had found together. Something profound had been healed in this forest clearing. Not just the lives of 4 cats rescued from winter's embrace, but something deeper within Elliot himself, something that had been frozen long before he'd found that tiny orange kitten crying at his door. As stars emerged overhead, illuminating both dwellings in silver light, Elliot understood with perfect clarity. Sometimes the most beautiful beginnings grow from what we believe to be endings. As delicate wildflowers push through the once frozen earth and birds reclaim the forest canopy with joyful song, Elliot sat on his porch watching the transformation that had touched both landscape and heart. The harsh winter that had once threatened to claim 4 precious lives had surrendered to spring's gentle promise, leaving behind not scars, but unexpected blessings. The small shelter he'd built now served as headquarters for the feline family, though their territory extended throughout the surrounding woods. Each morning, like clockwork, they would appear from various forest paths, Snowdrop leading the parade, to share breakfast with the man who had once been a stranger, but now occupied an unshakable place in their mysterious feline hearts. On this particular golden afternoon, as Snowdrop curled contentedly in his lap while her siblings played nearby, a realization washed over Elliot with breathtaking clarity. In his desperate attempt to save these creatures from winter's cruel grip, they had somehow saved him in return. The walls he'd built around his heart, fortress-like and impenetrable, had been dismantled not by force, but by the gentle persistence of tiny paws and trusting purrs. What had begun as a simple act of mercy had blossomed into profound connection, teaching this solitary man lessons that transcended words, that love often arrives in unexpected packages, that trust once broken can be rebuilt, and that second chances sometimes come disguised as impossible challenges in the darkest hours of winter nights.